The international community has strong consensus on solving the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula through diplomatic and political means, and such a direction is firm and clear. As for how to take actions towards this, China came up with the dual suspension proposal. We call for all concerned parties to actively consider this proposal and provide a constructive response. Of course, China is open to any solutions that could solve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula peacefully. We call for related parties to seize the opportunity and have the political courage to make a right political decision as soon as possible.
《演练中，我们按照作战要素进行编组，对侦察预警网络、指挥控制链路进行了调整优化。同时我们创新了战法和训法。
The United States is seeking to impose direct sanctions on a dozen Chinese banks that do business with North Korea in a bid to tighten the screw on Pyongyang. Ed Royce, chairman of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, says a list with the targeted Chinese entities has been handed over to the U.S. government, adding that it's time to impose the strongest pressure following the regime's nuclear test. The list is set to name 12 banks, including the country's largest financial institution, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, Agricultural Bank of China, and China Merchants Bank. Sources say Washington is currently reviewing the option of having North Korea return to the negotiating table, as it did in 2005 when it froze North Korean assets at Banco Delta Asia in Macau. In the face of increasing calls for a so-called secondary boycott or sanctions directly targeting Beijing, especially as the latest UN Security Council resolution failed to include an oil embargo on the North, China has toughened its rhetoric against the regime. While Beijing has stated it strongly opposes North Korea's repeated provocations, the Chinese ambassador to the UN said that Beijing condemns North Korea. Noting the shift in stance, pundits say the remarks reflect Beijing's changing opinion of the North's nuclear threat. Meanwhile, North Korea responded to the fresh UN sanctions on Thursday with its Asia-Pacific Peace Committee, an organization linked to the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, describing them as useless. Insisting the North Korean people are not afraid of sanctions, the committee stressed it only resorts to its nuclear program for self-defense.
Oh, I'm sorry, well, really we're talking, I'm sorry, translating Russian for you. 70 to 100,000 troops looks like are actually participating, and the Russians, we got elections for Putin coming up next year. Yes, we know who's going to win, but he's also doing a lot of things like saying, bigger pensions, higher minimum wage, standard of living, and, by the way, strong military power. Yeah. So you put all of that together, and this is much more aimed domestically than internationally, but certainly if you're, the three Baltic states, and you watch these big military exercises, and they're all going after these three fictional countries that are in the west of Belarus that are named, they look like they're the Balts that are attacking Russia, taking them out. Obviously, there's high propaganda value to put a lot of NATO allies on the back foot.
This is all theater.
It's all theater.
Yeah.
It's all theater.
All right, let's turn to North Korea because we really want to get into this. This is a serious story because of the missile capabilities. In the latest provocation, the Hermit Kingdom has threatened to sink Japan. It said that the country no longer needed to exist near us. The North Korea state agency went on to say that it would reduce the United States to, quote, ashes and darkness for its support of UN sanctions. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin also weighed in last night on Fox News, saying that sanctions are on the table for any country doing business with North Korea.
I've worked on an executive order that's ready. If the president wants to use it, we can stop trade with any country that does business with North Korea. We're going to be careful in using these tools, but the president is committed. We will use economic sanctions to bring North Korea to the table.
This coming as South Korea conducted its first live fire drill, testing advanced air-launched cruise missiles in the wake of the latest threats. What's your take on this, Ian?
Well, from the market perspective, what matters is the U.S.-China relationship and the fact that the Americans are willing to push the Chinese harder. Just yesterday, we saw the Trump administration enact CFIUS regulations to stop the Chinese from investing in new technology firm in the United States.
The lattice semiconductor deal.
Absolutely.
They blocked it.
And that matters to the markets. And so, I mean, if the Americans have said very clearly under Trump, these things are linked. If you don't help us on North Korea, we're prepared to hit you on Chinese trade and on Chinese investment. The markets will care. But so far, this has been a win for Trump. We had a 15-0 vote at the Security Council last week. It was a compromise. The Russians and Chinese didn't give the Americans everything they wanted, but they're by far harder sanctions than anything we've seen from a previous administration under Clinton, under Bush, under Obama. If they're executed, in other words, if the North Koreans don't cheat and if they don't smuggle and if the Chinese actually do what they say they're going to do, it's going to cost them well over $1 billion over the next year. They can't export textiles. They're not going to get as much oil coming in. North Koreans working abroad won't be able to have the same access to money to bring back. Those things are meaningful. It is squeezing North Korea.
Yeah, but Mitch makes the right point. We were talking about this earlier because of all of the talk about sanctions on the Chinese banks.
Right.
And you said?
And I said, look at how the Chinese are the biggest sovereign holder of U.S. treasuries. So
how much leverage do we really have?
And do we want to pay? We're going to pay $1,000 for a new telephone. Do we want to pay $2,000 for a new telephone?
Well, the point you're making, which is that, Mnuchin saying we have the tool to cut off the Chinese if we want to, that's not going to happen. And I don't think that we're heading for a trade war. But certainly the United States, China needs the U.S. more than the Americans need China. And North Korea is more of a threat to China in terms of instability in the backyard than it is the United States. So if you ask me, as we ratchet up small steps, not trade war, not incinerating the Korean Peninsula, but using some of the tools that we typically display when we engage in diplomacy with antagonists and with frenemies, the answer is the Americans have more ability to put a fist in our glove and make the Chinese respond in a more cooperative and constructive way. Now, the real question here is that going to get the North Koreans over the hump? And I would say the answer is no, because if you're Kim Jong-un, you see Gaddafi, no nukes, dead. You see Saddam Hussein, no nukes, dead. Kim Jong-un, nukes, not dead. And, he really does believe, and there's good reason for him to believe, that developing a robust nuclear capability, miniaturization, ICBMs, re-entry capability, that is helping to ensure the sanctity and the security, not just of his regime, but of him personally in avoiding a decapitation strike. He's not going to give that up.
It also validates his nation because look at neighboring countries that have nukes and they have economies. So is it a price of admission to have a robust economy that you need nukes in your arsenal?
I don't know if I'd go that far, but it certainly is a matter of great national pride. And also, let's keep in mind that under Kim Jong-un, the North Korean economy has done better than it did under his father. It's more diversified. There's been more focus on efficiency. There's been less focus on corruption. And that is a positive. We don't talk about it very much because Hermit Kingdom and they're a bunch of wackos and no human rights. But if
that's
you're
that's why I don't believe it. It's sort of like...
I know many that have visited, and if you see it, well, compared to where it was, right? I mean, we don't hear the stories about North Korean citizens eating tree bark to make it through a bad harvest. Actually, they're, again, a very underdeveloped economy, but they have much more pride in their leader today than they did 5 years ago.
Do these sanctions reverse that trend?
They do.
I mean, do they go far enough to do that?
No. And I think the Chinese will be unwilling to cut them off in terms of oil, and the Russians would certainly veto that because they don't want to potentially precipitate either a lash out by the North Koreans or a fragmentation of the regime because it's in their backyard. We're much more willing to do that. Doesn't affect us as much. So the national interests just don't line up in a way that makes North Korea solvable. Plus, at no point have we given them carrots. There have been lots of sticks, and I think Trump's been much more effective than other presidents in talking about what those sticks are. But so far, the idea of what the North Koreans might get if they were to freeze their nuclear program and freeze their ballistic missile development, something that's much more reasonable to expect than saying, oh, we demand that you get rid of all of your nukes. Like, that's just not a feasible negotiating position. Even a starting position for the Americans. So we aren't yet really talking reality. And I mean, ping-pong diplomacy worked with the Chinese. I don't think Dennis Rodman diplomacy is going to work with the North Koreans. To what extent would we feel in any way comfortable that if Kim Jong-un was gone, that we could control the nuclear weapons, where they'd actually be, the technology, that we would have influence over what a post-Kim Jong-un regime would look like and the military leaders? We don't have the intelligence, we don't have the access, we certainly don't have the certainty. Why would we consider something like that?
It's all about China.
I think, well, even the Chinese, the fact that the Chinese are now getting hit by cyber attacks from the North Koreans like WannaCry, the fact that, you know, Kim Jong-un's half-brother, who was under Chinese protection, was assassinated under Kim Jong-un. If you're China, you're really not happy with this regime. And frankly, you know, Kim Jong-un has done a lot more to push the South Koreans towards the U.S. than Trump has done to push South Korea towards China. And Beijing is deeply dissatisfied with what that's doing to their geostrategic position in the region.
Real quick, before you go,
Japan is hard to physically imagine. What I certainly can say is that the North Koreans consistently impress me with how colorful their propaganda is. Trump really has nothing. He would have to learn for years before he could get up to that level of incendiary bluster. And also, if we've seen Trump's Twitter account over the last couple of weeks, he's much less unhinged. So he's moving in another direction. He's looking more like Merkel. Kim Jong-un is out-Trumping Trump on that front.
Wow.
A unanimous vote to rein in the DPRK after its most powerful nuclear test by far. According to U.S. estimates, the new sanctions would amount to a 10% cut in oil products shipped into the DPRK, and a ban on all of its textile exports would likely strip Pyongyang of more than $700 million in annual revenue. The DPRK rejected and condemned the resolution.
The adoption of sanction resolution against my country is an extreme manifestation of U.S. intention to eliminate at any cost the ideology, social system of DPRK and its people.
This UN resolution comes just a month after previous bans on DPRK exports of coal, lead, and seafood. That round of sanctions did little to persuade the DPRK from carrying out its sixth nuclear test on September 3 and announced it was a hydrogen bomb. The DPRK also vowed to inflict on the U.S. the greatest pain and suffering it had ever gone through.
The North Korean regime has...
But the U.S., which drafted the resolution, says Pyongyang can still find a way out. China has been calling for a suspension of the DPRK's nuclear and missile testing on one hand, and a halt to joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises on the other. However, neither Pyongyang nor Washington seems to be buying this double suspension. Now, China endorses this wave of sanctions, reiterating its position that talks should happen sooner than later.
China unswervingly stands for denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, maintaining peace and stability there, and resolving the problems through dialogue and consultation.
So far, repeated sanctions have failed to deter the DPRK from continuing with its weapon development program. On the contrary, it has been testing more powerful bombs with a higher frequency in recent years. There is a big question mark over whether the latest sanctions will make any difference.
Could the new UN sanctions on the DPRK work? For some answers about that, we have in our Beijing studio Zhao Tong, fellow in the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, based at Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy here in Beijing. Welcome to our program. In Washington, D.C., the United States, we invited Douglas Paul, the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Paul, welcome. And joining us in London from the UK, Ian Begg, who's a professorial research fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and associate fellow at the Chatham House. Welcome as well, Mr. Begg. I want to start with the Chinese and the American panelist, Mr. Zhao. 15-0, that's the number of votes UN Security Council for this round of sanction. Quite a victory, some would say, in agreed actions. What does it say?
Well, it says that the international community is consensus about the need to punish North Korea for its most recent provocations by testing what was likely a hydrogen bomb. However, there was still major disagreements about how far the sanctions should go in terms of punishing North Korea. But we have a good resolution which imposes unprecedented pressure on North Korea.
I see. Mr. Paul, before we talk about the rhetorics already flying around after the sanctions, let's just focus on the sanction itself. Could they be considered as a success?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say a success. I'd say it's another incremental step up in efforts to persuade North Korea and China to be more helpful in bringing this set of programs in missiles and nuclear testing to an end. I'm skeptical it's going to work, but I think it's very important that you have diplomatic cooperation. Eventually, we probably will be left with containment and deterrence. And for those two things to work with North Korea, you need international cooperation. So going through the diplomatic process of the UN Security Council helps to hold that cooperation together for the long term.
Well, when we talk about the cooperation, certainly it's not just China and the United States, but many other more members of Security Council, including the permanent ones. And Mr. Begg, you're coming from the UK. You definitely understand what I'm talking about. There seems to be a unity.
As your previous speaker just said, because if the international community is divided, it's very easy for the rogue state, that's what we call it, North Korea, to go its own way.
Well, the voice volume from Mr. Begg is relatively low, so we're going to adjust that a little bit. But for now, let me come back to you, Mr. Zhao. Earlier, we talked about that. Well, there seems to be some unity in at least this round of sanctions, but words already coming out. For example, President Trump, in meeting with an Asian visiting leader, he was talking about these are just small steps. Whether it's going to work or not, it's not clear. Obviously, it seemed to be a apparent brush off of what many consider as an effort by the international community for a long time to come. What do you make of those remarks?
Well, the United States has long wanted to impose the so-called crippling economic sanctions on North Korea, which is basically a comprehensive economic embargo that would completely cut off all North Korea's economic lifeline, making the regime incapable of sustaining itself. So the original text of the resolution proposed by the UN ambassador from the United States included all the most radical measures, such as completely cutting off the crude oil supply, completely seizing the assets of even the top leader Kim Jong-un, etc. But of course, countries like Russia and China have different concerns. They worry about the unpredictable consequences of a regime instability in North Korea. But finally, I think they were able to reach some agreement with somewhat watered down resolution, which can still impose important pressure on North Korea without, short of making the regime unstable.
When we talk about the debate between China, Russia, and the United States, for example, as to what are the specific wording of this sanction, Mr. Begg, I understand you could speak now. What have been the roles of the others, let's just say, of the Security Council? Some of the European members of it included at this point in terms of this sanction, this round, and probably in the future when it comes to so-called ally cooperation, President Trump from the U.S. also talked about.
Well, we have to remember that two permanent members of the Security Council are European, France and the UK, so they inevitably have a significant influence on the other members of the Security Council. Plus, they speak in practice on behalf of the entire European Union, which is a significant economic power, even though its political power is sometimes less than its economic weight. I think what we're seeing now with this is more of a consensus at international level on trying to deal with North Korea. But I would come back to a very, very obvious point to make, is that when you impose sanctions that hit people, and the people do not have a direct way of influencing the leadership, it's highly unlikely to be effective in the way that you would want it to be.
several things going on. You know, textile exports from North Korea being cut off, petrol products into North Korea being cut off, labor exports from North Korea to other countries being cut off, and prevention of any joint venture in North Korea or with North Korea being now out of the question. So, Mr. Paul, will these measures work to what extent?
I think that the choice we're trying to impose on North Korea through deprivation of resources and cash is not going to be enough to compensate for the preference that North Korea has. And that preference is guided by the example of Muammar Gaddafi yielding his nuclear capabilities to the U.S. in the early 2000s, only to end up in a ditch dead in 2011. And Saddam Hussein having threatened and then dismantled his capabilities and then ending up hanged in a prison in Baghdad. And the motivation of Kim Jong-un is to avoid the fates of those men, no matter what the deprivation imposed upon him or his society.
But you know, Mr. Paul, when you are making that comparison, it really alerted a lot of ears because Gaddafi's, for example, it was about regime change. And a series of regime change in the Middle East have their impact in that region and the rest of the world too, after Iraq. So China, Russia also have been totally against any idea related to regime change in the DPRK from the United States or anywhere else. Mr. Paul, do you think all parties realize that there should be some common ground and prohibitions that they shouldn't touch on, Mr. Paul, U.S. included?
Preservation of the North Korean regime in order to maintain regional stability doesn't seem to be an option either, because the North is determined to change the security relationships in the region, to try to dismantle the U.S. Alliances with Japan and South Korea, to try to reunify the peninsula under North Korean rule. And that's at the macro level. At the micro level, our experience is entirely distasteful. They took a student from the U.S. who did a schoolboy prank and put him in jail and essentially killed him in the past year. So where do we deal with this kind of regime in a way that maintains stability? I think this is it's a stability where you have to overlook a lot of instability to try to find it.
Mr. Beck,